In 1991, Nintendo committed the most expensive act of corporate sabotage in history. How did a simple oversight create their greatest rival? This is the story of how pride changed everything. The best-selling console of the 90s was never meant to exist. It was born from pure, unadulterated spite, forged in the fires of a public betrayal that left the entire tech world breathless. In 1988, Nintendo owned the world. They were the undisputed kings of the living room, but they knew their reign was threatened by the limits of plastic cartridges. They needed CD technology, so they turned to Sony. At the time, Sony was the gold standard of electronics, the geniuses behind the Walkman. It seemed like a match made in heaven. They signed a contract for Sony to build a revolutionary audio chip and a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. For a moment, it looked like an alliance that would rule the decade. But Nintendo didn't play well with others. Under the iron-fisted rule of Hiroshi Yamauchi, they demanded absolute control over every piece of hardware and software that touched their brand. As the project moved forward, Nintendo's executives looked closer at that 1988 contract and felt the blood drain from their faces. They realized they'd made a catastrophic oversight. The deal gave Sony the rights to license and control every single CD-ROM game for the new system. To Yamauchi, this wasn't just a mistake. It was a threat to his empire. He wasn't about to let Sony take his throne. Instead of picking up the phone to renegotiate like a professional partner, he chose the path of the assassin. He secretly dispatched his team to Europe to strike a backroom deal with Sony's rival, Philips. While Sony was busy perfecting the technology, Nintendo was sharpening a knife in the dark. They were setting a trap on a global scale, and Sony was walking into it with a smile on its face, completely blind to the betrayal about to unfold. June 1st, 1991. The Chicago air was thick with anticipation at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show. At the Sony booth, the mood was triumphant. Executives stood proudly before a sea of cameras to unveil the PlayStation, a Super Nintendo with a built-in CD drive. It was the future, and Sony owned it. But that glory lasted exactly one day. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Nintendo executive Howard Lincoln took the stage for a surprise press conference. Without a single word of warning to Sony, he dropped a nuclear bomb. He announced that Nintendo was ditching Sony to partner with their rival Philips. It was a public execution, calculated to cause maximum humiliation. Sony's team was forced to read about their own professional demise in the morning papers while standing in the very building where they'd celebrated 24 hours earlier. If you're as obsessed with these high-stakes corporate wars as I am, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss a single chapter of this revenge story. Because believe me, Nintendo had no idea what they had just started. The humiliation was absolute. Sony was a titan of industry, a name that commanded respect, and they had been made to look like amateurs on a global stage. The shockwaves traveled all the way back to Tokyo, leaving the board of directors in a state of stunned disbelief. For a year, the two companies remained locked in a bitter Cold War standoff. Sony tried to salvage the deal, but Nintendo held every card and refused to budge an inch. By the summer of 1992, the project was officially dead. Most of the Sony executives were relieved. They'd always looked down on video games as childish toys that were beneath a premium brand like theirs. They wanted to bury the embarrassment and never speak of it again. But there was one man who refused to let the wound heal. Ken Kutaragi was a brilliant, stubborn engineer who had designed the very sound chip that made the Super Nintendo sing. He had watched the betrayal with a quiet, white-hot fury that terrified his colleagues. While the old guard wanted to walk away with their tails between their legs, Kutaragi was already planning his move. He wasn't interested in an apology. He was interested in a reckoning. I remember the tension in that boardroom on June 24, 1992. It was thick enough to choke on. Most of the men sitting around that table in Tokyo were terrified of the video game market. They wanted to bury the embarrassment of the Nintendo deal and never look back. But Ken Kutaragi wasn't like them. He stood there with a proposal that felt like a suicide mission. He didn't want to build an accessory for someone else's machine anymore. He wanted Sony to build its own standalone console, something capable of rendering real-time three-dimensional graphics. The board members practically laughed in his face. They called it a waste of money, a distraction from our real business. Kutaragi was backed into a corner, but he knew exactly which button to press. He turned to our CEO, Norio Oga, and brought up the one thing no one dared to mention: the humiliation we suffered in Chicago. He asked if we were really going to let Nintendo get away with it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the anger flushing across Oga's face as the memory of that betrayal took hold. When he finally slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoed like a gunshot. He looked Kutaragi in the eye and shouted for him to do it. The project was alive, but we were risking everything on a grudge. With the CEO's blessing, Kutaragi moved fast, but he was still fighting a war on two fronts. The traditional hardware divisions at Sony treated us like outcasts, refusing to share even the most basic resources. They thought we were playing with toys. So, in November of 1993, we had to get creative. We established Sony Computer Entertainment as a joint venture with Sony Music. It was a brilliant move that bypassed the corporate red tape entirely. You see, the music side of the house already knew how to talk to teenagers and young adults. They knew how to make things cool. More importantly, they knew how to manufacture compact discs at a scale Nintendo couldn't dream of. While Nintendo was still clinging to those expensive, limited plastic cartridges, we were building our future on cheap CD-ROMs. I spent those months quietly reaching out to third-party developers, the ones who were tired of Nintendo's iron-fisted control and ridiculous fees. We offered them something Nintendo never would: creative freedom and a way to make games that actually looked like the future. It was our first real plant in the ground, a hidden strength that would eventually blow the whole industry wide open. If you're following this journey of corporate revenge, make sure you stay tuned for the next part. Building a revolution isn't easy, and there were nights when I thought the whole thing would collapse under its own weight. The engineering hurdles were massive. Kutaragi wanted a processor that could handle thousands of polygons every second, something that usually required $1 million supercomputer. We were working in the dark, fighting against overheating boards and software bugs that seemed impossible to squash. And the pressure wasn't just coming from inside the building. Sega had caught wind of what we were doing, and they were rushing their own CD-based console, the Saturn, to beat us to the punch. When we finally launched the PlayStation in Japan on December 3, 1994, the relief was overwhelming. 100,000 units vanished from shelves instantly. But the celebration didn't last long. Sega was right there with us, and the battle for Japan was a bloody, neck-and-neck fight for every single customer. We realized then that the real test wouldn't be in Tokyo. To truly destroy Nintendo's legacy, we had to win in North America. But just as we started preparing for the Western launch, the rumors started. Our American team, led by Steve Race, knew we couldn't play by the old rules. This wasn't just about selling a piece of plastic. It was a war for the soul of the living room. We had to be ruthless. We stopped looking at the PlayStation as a child's toy and started marketing it as a sleek, futuristic system for the people who actually had the money. Older teens and adults who wanted something mature. We secured exclusive titles that looked like nothing else on the market, games with vast, three-dimensional worlds that made Nintendo's colorful characters look like relics of a bygone era. We were evolving, shifting from an electronics company into a cultural powerhouse. It felt like we were finally standing on our own 2 feet, but the moral weight of the gamble was heavy. We were betting billions on a market everyone else told us was a dead end, risking the reputation Sony had built over 50 years. We were about to walk into the first ever E3 Inches Los Angeles, and I knew that whatever happened in that convention center would change our lives forever. May 11th, 1995. The Los Angeles Convention Center was electric. It was the very first E3, and you could feel the desperation in the air. Sega went first, and they decided to go for the throat. In a move that caught everyone, including us, completely off guard, they announced that the Saturn wasn't launching in the fall. It was launching that very morning. They dropped the price at $399 and basically told the world that if they wanted the future, they could go buy it right now. The room went wild. Retailers were panicking, and the press was already crowning Sega the winner. It felt like the walls were closing in on us. Nintendo was still stumbling around in the background trying to finish a cartridge machine that already felt obsolete. But Sega had just stolen our thunder. We were backstage, watching the chaos unfold, knowing our presentation was next. We had one chance to respond, one bullet left in the chamber. If we missed, all those years of work and all that anger would be for nothing. We took a breath and stepped out into the light, ready to reveal the secret we'd been guarding. The lights went down and the room fell silent. We started our presentation with everything we had, showing off jaw-dropping footage of Ridge Racer and Tekken. You could hear the gasps in the audience as those three-dimensional graphics filled the screen. It was clear our tech was light years ahead of anything Sega or Nintendo had. But as the demo ended, the same question was hanging over everyone's head. What would it cost? Sega had set the bar at $399. If we couldn't match that, we were dead on arrival. The tension was so thick I could hardly breathe as Olaf Olafsson finished his speech and invited Steve Race to the podium. This was it, the culmination of 4 years of planning and a lifetime of resentment toward the people who tried to bury us. Steve walked up those steps with a smirk that told me he knew something the rest of the world didn't. He approached the microphone, carrying a small stack of papers. He didn't look nervous at all. In fact, he looked like a man who knew he was about to make history. If you want to see the fallout of what happened next, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the final reckoning. This was the moment everything changed. I watched from the wings as Steve Race walked toward the podium. He didn't look like a man about to deliver a corporate presentation. He looked like an assassin. He didn't shuffle any papers or adjust the height of the microphone. He didn't waste a single second on buzzwords about synergy or the future of digital entertainment. He simply leaned in, his voice calm and cold, and uttered 3 digits that changed the world forever. 299. Then, without a word of explanation or a secondary slide, he turned and walked off the stage. The silence in the auditorium lasted for maybe half a heartbeat before the room absolutely exploded. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard, the sound of an entire industry shifting on its axis. With those 3 words, we had effectively executed Sega's strategy in front of a live audience, undercutting their price point by a full $100. It was more than a competitive move. It was a public execution. The poetic justice of that moment wasn't just about the sales figures. It was the realization that Nintendo's attempt to bury us back in 1991 had failed in the most spectacular way possible. By trying to crush our spirit, Yamauchi had accidentally forged his own greatest rival. I could almost feel the weight of those years of humiliation lifting off my shoulders. My revenge wasn't a theory anymore. It was a reality. The aftermath was nothing short of a slaughter, and I watched every moment of it with a grim sense of satisfaction. The PlayStation didn't just compete, it dominated, eventually becoming the first console in history to move over 100 million units. Sega Saturn, crippled by that disastrous surprise launch and an impossibly complex architecture, began a slow, agonizing spiral that would eventually force them out of the hardware business entirely. But it was Nintendo's fall that felt the most earned. The undisputed kings of the 80s suddenly found themselves looking up from the bottom of a hole they had dug for themselves. Their stubborn refusal to abandon expensive, limited cartridges drove their most loyal partners, including the legendary creators of Final Fantasy, straight into my arms. I welcomed them with open doors and the massive storage capacity of a compact disc. Nintendo was forced into a distant second place, bleeding market share while they struggled to understand how their empire had crumbled so quickly. The humiliation they had tried to inflict on me in Chicago had boomeranged with a force that shattered their legacy. They had played a high-stakes game of corporate sabotage, but they forgot one crucial rule. If you're going to try and destroy someone, you'd better make sure you finish the job. I watched as Sony transformed from a conservative electronics manufacturer into the undisputed heartbeat of global culture. We weren't just making toys anymore. We were making the PlayStation, and suddenly gaming was for everyone. We brought consoles into nightclubs and onto movie sets, proving that this medium belonged to adults just as much as children. The stigma that had once threatened to tarnish the Sony brand was gone, replaced by an aura of cool that our rivals couldn't hope to replicate. I was no longer the crazy engineer shouting in boardrooms. I was hailed as a visionary, eventually rising to the highest executive ranks as the father of the PlayStation. It was a revelation to the rest of the company that my obsession had been their salvation. I had spent years being told that my passion was a liability, only to prove that it was the very thing that would define Sony's future. The shame of that day in Chicago was finally completely erased. The story of the PlayStation is the ultimate lesson in corporate karma. It serves as a reminder that arrogance is usually the architect of its own downfall. If Nintendo had simply honored their word and respected the contract we signed, the world of entertainment would look unrecognizable today. Instead, their betrayal gave me the fuel I needed to build the monster that devoured their kingdom. I hope you enjoyed this journey through the coldest revenge in gaming history. If you want to see more stories where the underdog finally bites back, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. I have other scores to settle, and I'd love to hear in the comments which corporate war you want me to cover next. Until then, remember that the best way to get even is to win.